Hello and welcome back to another update. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance in the eastern section of the front line near the Siverskyi river line. The Ukrainians made a small counterattack, displacing some of the Russian frontline positions. The Russians managed to advance within Chasiv Yar in the western flank of Toretsk, and in the northern parts of it the Russians also managed to advance in between Pokrovsk and Toretsk in a pinning maneuver of the Ukrainian forces. The Russians also managed to make several advances west of Pokrovsk and near Kharkiv, as well as in the Velyka Novosilka direction. The pinning maneuvers in the area between Toretsk and Pokrovsk is part of the operation of the Russian armed forces for the largest encirclement of any side of this war since the encirclement of Mariupol at the very start of the war. Thousands of Ukrainian soldiers are located in between the two cities of Toretsk and Pokrovsk, and the Russians are looking to encircle that grouping of forces located along the fortified positions in between the two cities by attacking the supply lines in the northern outskirts and cutting off all roads. We're currently seeing an operation by the Russians to attack both the western and eastern flank of this grouping of forces here in the center along the significant layers of fortified positions. The Russians are attacking and storming Zelene Pole in the western direction. The objective here is to cut off that road and move alongside it towards Oleksandropil in the north, which will allow them to cut off the western flank. At the same time, the Russians have captured Toretsk. It has been fairly inactive since the 18th, which is a week ago, where the Russians are consolidating their gains with the capture of the city and planning operations to capture the remaining fortified positions west of the city through a push on the western part along the Toretsk river. Then the Russians will be looking to attack alongside the reservoir further north and towards the highway that connects Konstantinivka with this grouping, cutting off that road as well as the roads here to the west along Oleksandropil. And there we go, there is a small area in between the two areas, which is open fields. There's barely any forest lines, and it is a large area which the Ukrainian forces have to move through to resupply and send reinforcements or whichever is needed. While the Russians will have reconnaissance over the area, they will have fire control over the area, which will operationally encircle the Ukrainian grouping in the area. And at the same time, there will be no paved roads. We're currently on the 25th of January. That is why the Russians are able to launch operations across the fields, because most of the ground would be frozen at this point due to it being in the smack middle of the winter. However, we'll soon be moving into February and March, where the ground will unfreeze and it'll become muddy again. And at that point, constantly moving equipment, reinforcements, supplies, and so on through these open fields becomes extremely difficult. And therefore, not only will the Ukrainian forces be operationally encircled, they may also be completely encircled due to the inability to use these fields to resupply the forces or to withdraw from the area. This will lead to a significant change in the section of the front line, because surrounding what is two fully equipped territorial defense brigades, which means upwards of 5,000 to 10,000 soldiers who are fully equipped based on fortified positions, for them to be encircled would be a massive hit to the Ukrainian positions in the area. And the Russians have now begun pinning operations here to the south in the direction of Kharkiv and in the direction of the fortified positions, where the objective is to keep the Ukrainian forces there by launching these offensive operations. If the Ukrainians decide to withdraw, then the Russians will catch up to them and they will inflict heavy casualties during their withdrawal. If they decide to stay, then the Russian forces are attacking on the flanks to capture their positions and encircle their forces. Therefore, the Russians are now launching a massive operation for the largest encirclement of Ukrainian forces since the encirclement of Mariupol in the start of the war, where the Russians surrounded thousands of Ukrainian troops in the Azov steel plant and the city as a whole. Now let's go to the edge of the updates. We see here in the direction of Makivka, the Russians have advanced north of the town in the western bank of the Siverskyi river line to expand their foothold further across and gain a proper bridgehead where they can supply larger amounts of forces across the river line to then launch operations in the western direction. The Ukrainians launched a counterattack, pushing the Russians back from their hold over the fortified position in between Kolodiasy and Ivanivka, where the objective is to push the Russians way out across the river line. However, the Russians are still continuing to fight over these fortified positions, the set of 3, which is located here to the west of Ivanivka, to create a strong flank for the bridgehead across. However, this new counterattack by the Ukrainians indicates that they've been able to gather forces from different parts, possibly across the Siverskyi river line, to launch this counterattack, which endangers the entire Russian grouping across the Siverskyi river line, because if they're able to displace the Russian forces from the current positions and the fortified areas, they'll be able to successfully push towards the Siverskyi river line, and thereby they'll be able to cut off the supply of the Russian forces across and get rid of this bridgehead. This will set back the Russian forces in the area significantly. Therefore, we can expect very heavy fighting here in this area over the next coming days, as Russians will continue to double down on their bridgehead and attempt to gain control over further fortified positions, further strengthening their positions, but the Ukrainians will be looking to displace this bridgehead and destroy it. Further south, the Russians have managed to advance within Joseph Yar in the southern parts of it, fighting over some of the fortified positions in the area and improving their positions in the southern flank. The objective is to encircle the Ukrainian grouping in the forest patch area and to gain full control of it. This will secure their positions within the central parts of Joseph Yar as the siege over the apartment complex area continues in the central parts of the city. The Russians also managed to advance in the northern parts and southwestern outskirts of Toretsk, where they've managed to gain control over another street in Krimsky, small advance where they fight over the remaining parts of the industrial area and residential area of Krimsky. At the same time, the Russians have also managed to advance west of New York, where they captured another fortified position and fighting in the direction of supporting the pinning maneuver of the Ukrainian forces here in the fortified areas in between Toretsk and Pokrovsk. The Russians also managed to advance alongside the fortified positions to the south of it and in the direction of Selenopole, where they're fighting over the fortified positions south of the village. The Russians also managed to capture the fortified positions west of Baranivka as they continue their offensive operations on the western bank of the river line here north of Vostyshenka, where the Russians are looking to advance alongside the highway to the west and the river line to the east, and upwards along the highway towards Konstantinivka, fighting over the fortified positions and pinning the Ukrainian forces in this direction in the area, preventing them from sending support and reinforcements towards the pocket itself. The Russians have an interest in doing so as the highway itself is located on the high ground, and with the flank having the river line near it, it allowed the Russians to fight the Ukrainian forces on even ground, flanking the fortified positions from the weak point from the side, and this allows the Russians to have the greatest advantage possible against these fortified positions, and therefore they'll take advantage of that to advance alongside it. This will allow the Russians to gain full control over the fortified areas along the highway and around the pocket that they are creating here north of Avdiivka. The Russians have made several advances west of Pokrovsk as well. They've managed to advance northwest of Kotline in the direction of Odashne and to the south of Odashne as well, where they're looking to connect in a pincer maneuver towards the central parts of the village, with recent Ukrainian counterattacks attempting to displace the Russian forces within the village. The Russians are now flanking them from the north and from the south. The Russians also managed to advance south of Novosilka, capturing additional forest lines and roads connecting the different parts of the front line. The Russians stormed Nadiivka, gaining control over parts of the town, gaining a foothold in the southern parts of it, and fighting to gain a foothold in the northern parts as well, while gaining control over a forest line to the east, northwest of Novosibirsk, in an attempt to fight over the fortified positions north of Nadiivka, as the Russians continued offensive operations towards the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians also advanced west of Yasenova in the direction of Novoandrivka, where they are getting closer to gaining full control of the town, attacking it from the north, east, and south, before moving onwards towards Sritne and again the Dnipropetrovsk region. In the Kurhova section of the front line, the Russians managed to advance further towards Dashne, gaining a foothold in the northern parts of the town, as the Russians started the storming of the town to gain full control of it. This push from the northern direction indicates that the Russians are now attempting to spread out the defense of Dashne by attacking it from as many possible directions as possible. The Russians also managed to advance north of Siverskyi, gaining control over several forest lines and fields, advancing further along the Siverskyi River towards Velyka in the west and towards the fortified positions in the center. This also improves the Russian positions for further fighting from north of Yantana towards Dashny from the south. Therefore, the Russians are increasing the pressure from the southern flank near the Siverskyi river line as well. In the direction of Velyka and Novosilka, the Russians gain control of the eastern parts. This is actually an update from yesterday that I missed from Deep State map. And the grouping of the Ukrainian forces within the town itself is completely in the gray zone, as was stated by Deep State map. This is why I stated yesterday that the town itself can be considered already lost by the Ukrainians, because once it is considered a gray zone by Deep State map, it practically means that the Ukrainians have no control over the situation and their forces have either completely withdrawn or been defeated. The Russians are simply clearing out the final houses, the basements, whatever is left of Ukrainian forces that managed to survive were now being cleared out. This can take a couple of days, but this town itself can be considered captured by the Russians. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.